Hello, and welcome back to another episode of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's episode, I want to explore a different understanding of stress. So, I want to talk about the traditional stress response that most of us are familiar with, the fight or flight response. But I also want to spend some time talking about some newer understandings of stress, and in particular, something called the challenge response to stress. I started learning about this about a year ago with one of my teachers, Dr. Laura Stuve. And if this topic really intrigues you, before I forget, I have a book recommendation for you, which is called The Upside of Stress by Dr. Kelly McGonigal. And let me just first say that this book is written for a layperson, so it's not super high-level scientific information, but it is a great read, and I highly recommend it if after listening to this episode, you want to learn a little bit more about this idea of seeing stress differently, and there actually being more than one types of stress response. So let's start out, though, by talking a little bit about the one type of stress response that many of us are familiar with, which is the fight or flight response. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the challenge response and how it differs from fight or flight. So fight or flight is really, many of us are familiar with it. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I do want to just kind of highlight a little bit of how it evolved, what was going on, and what goes on in our bodies when we go into the fight or flight mode. So fight or flight is really our kind of instinctive old wiring as human beings on this planet who've been around for a long time. And if you think about how we used to live several thousand years ago, we didn't live in houses. We lived off of the land. You know, if we had some place to live, it wasn't something that protected us from wild animals. So we were much more subject to predators, you know, tigers in certain areas of the world, bears, large animals that could kill us. And so we needed this particular response to be able to survive, because we don't have, as humans, a lot of ways to really fight off those type of wild animals compared to their sharp claws and big teeth. So we needed to be ready to run away for our lives, or if we couldn't run away, to try and fight to stay alive. So in the traditional fight or flight response, our body is really primed to do those actions that will help us survive in that immediate moment of a threat to our very survival. So blood gets prioritized to bigger muscles that help us run away. Our lungs and our heart prepare for that running away. So our heartbeat will get faster. More blood goes to the lungs so that you have the oxygen that you need to run away. And certain other tasks and physiological processes in our bodies get deprioritized by stress. So digesting your lunch, not super important when you are running for your life from a tiger. Reproduction, not super important. Your immune function actually isn't super important, because fighting off a cold isn't really going to be a big priority compared to surviving that. And so any tasks to do with our immune system are more like if we were to get bitten by something, then our immune system is ready to kind of fight off anything that comes along in terms of that. So there's more inflammation in our system from that. So evolutionarily, this was great, right? And it worked to keep humans alive for thousands and thousands of years. But as we've evolved and our lives have changed, this stress response hasn't really changed along with our bodies. So the nature of the stress that many of us face in modern life is not being chased by a wild tiger, but instead is kind of the challenges of everyday life. So dealing with traffic and dealing with frustrations with family members, a boss, lots of work to do. Like, these are a different type of stress. And so the problem is our bodies are still responding to those stressors in many cases, like it was a wild tiger, but we're not running away from it. We're sitting at a desk usually, or we're sitting in our car, and all of the hormones and neurotransmitters that get released in the fight or flight response, instead of getting metabolized quickly because we are running away or fighting for our lives, we're sitting in them and sitting in our desks and at chairs and in cars. We're sitting with this chemical concoction in our body, and it's not getting processed and released. So a beautiful example of how these chemicals usually get processed is if you think of what happens with like a wild animal who might be threatened by another predator. So they run away and they safely get away, and then they actually shake it off. Like there's actually now for people a particular way of trying to address stress which taps into that response, which is wired into our bodies to actually shake off stress. But for most of us, we don't do that. We just kind of sit in it. And the other problem is that the stress response for many of us gets turned on and off and on and off constantly all day long. And that's not really very adaptive either for our bodies. It was stress response, fight or flight was designed to be used occasionally when that predator came along, which probably wasn't like every 5 minutes. But for some of us, we get triggered by stressors that often during our day, constantly. And, one stress and you barely start to recover from that. And then another stressor and another stressor and another stressor. So this is kind of just basically our understanding of the fight or flight response. But with new research, right, we have a better understanding of other types of stress. Oh, before I was just looking at my notes. Before I go into the challenge response, I actually want to share an interesting study, which was a study over the course of 50 years of veterans and looking at 2 different types of stress in their life. So the first category would be major life events. So somebody dies, you're in a car accident, different kinds of trauma. Basically, things that fall in that trauma category are major life events. You get really sick with an illness. But then there's the second category, which is just the daily life stressors. So traffic, somebody is irritated with you at work, the pile of work is really big and the amount of time in your day is short. Those are kind of more like daily life stressors. So what this study found was that there is a 3-fold higher incidence in death in the group that had the highest stress levels. So they were 3 times more likely to die. But the thing that's really interesting about the study is that it's only for those with those daily life stressors. It actually wasn't anything to do really, that death likelihood going up didn't have to do with the bigger traumas, which is really fascinating because I think many of us would think, if you went through a divorce, if you were just in a major car accident, you just had someone close to you pass away, you'd think that those things would be very, very stressful and therefore would impact this kind of longevity of your life. And yet what the study found was it was really the daily stressor. And what they also found in this study is that attitude is the key in how we respond to daily stress. And this is kind of going to lead right into talking about the challenge response. So if we get really annoyed by every little thing, and who hasn't been there? I can relate. There are some days where I do feel irritable and, like I'm trying to do my workout on the TV and the TV doesn't want to cooperate. And then, my computer is being glitchy. Some days we can get irritated and we get annoyed. But if we learn to adapt kind of the attitude of, oh, it's not a big deal, these are just little things, life happens, then our body responds differently and we're less likely to have those long-term impacts on our health. So now let's talk about challenge mode or challenge response to stress. What is it? So I want you to think about things in your life that you need to or want to do, and they might be challenging or difficult, but you know that you can do them. They just require some focus, some performance under pressure. So this could be times that you've had to make a speech at work or a public it's public speaking. It could be taking a test. So we all have that in our educational experiences, taking an important test, maybe when you were taking your exams to get into college, your ACT or your SATs, competing in a sport if you were ever in athletics, if climbing a mountain, right? Climbing something it's a hard task to get uphill, but you can do it, right? It just takes that commitment to do it. So these are the types of things, types of activities that help us understand what challenge response is. So instead, and when we go into this response mode, instead of fight or flight, instead of our bodies preparing for us to run for our lives, what happens instead in our body is that the challenge response gives us more energy and focus and mental resources for that task. So especially thinking about things like the public speaking, taking a test, your mind gets really sharp and ready for this particular task. We get motivated and we are encouraged to take action because we're not in that, you're not really focused on taking action in your life if you're running away for your life. That's your priority, is to just survive. And it helps with that peak performance. So instead of kind of that fight or flight model where we're focused on just surviving and avoiding harm, not dying, basically, challenge mode is focused on actually going for what you want in life. And there are lots of things, that we all want that may be different for me than for you. But when I started this podcast, for example, that was something that I decided that I wanted to go for, and that was important to me for sharing my message and my mission. And I could have kind of gotten all freaked out and went into a fight or flight type of a response and had all sorts of adrenaline and cortisol and, thought that this was like a wild tiger chasing me, even though it wasn't. Or I could tap into this idea of challenge mode and say, okay, I'm going to go for what I want. And when we go for what we want and we use that mindset piece of that's what I'm going to do, I'm going to go for what I want, our body actually responds differently. And let's talk then about how the body responds differently to stress in this sense than to the fight or flight type of stress. So in many ways, the body responds like we are actually just doing physical exercise. We're working out, so to speak. So our blood vessels actually stay relaxed when our heart rate goes up. So in fight or flight, the blood vessels don't stay relaxed, and we're bringing blood actually from the periphery into the core more of the body to make sure if something bit us, we don't bleed to death. In this case, in challenge response, our blood vessels stay relaxed. And this is good for the type of stress we deal with, because if our blood vessels stay relaxed, then it's not impacting our things like our blood pressure and our heart as much. Our heart will beat faster, but it also beats stronger. So again, this is like an exercise. Your heart rate will go up when you're working out, but your heart rate beats stronger. It pumps the blood more efficiently, and more blood then is pumped with each beat of the heart, so you have more energy. So that's one of the things that happens, is your body stays more relaxed in this. Yes, it's preparing and it's expending some energy, and it's also generating energy, but your body is not prepared to run away and survive this danger. It's more like I'm exercising and it's challenging. And then also what happens in your brain. So one of the things that happens is your brain actually starts to learn stress resilience. And resilience is a great thing, especially in modern society when we deal with stress a lot. And so we need resilience to deal with stress. A particular hormone called DHEA is increased, and DHEA is actually one of the things that counteracts and counterbalances cortisol in our bodies. Nerve growth factor increases, and so that's supporting kind of our brain health and our ability to learn and grow. And then our prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is the part that's kind of under our forehead, and that's our most highest logical thinking part of our brain, it actually starts to suppress fear. It suppresses that more primitive part of our brain, and it enhances our motivation so that we can keep going. So it's really cool when we understand that our bodies can respond differently. Instead of just constantly feeling stressed out, your heart is racing, your palms get sweaty, and yet you're not being chased by a wild tiger, your body can respond a little bit differently in this challenge mode. So long term, this leads to more longevity. So going back to that study, the 50-year study of veterans, longer life, less likelihood of dying earlier in life, and health benefits without the chronic stress adverse effects. So the challenge mode is much better for us if we can tap into it. Of course, we want fight or flight where it's appropriate. If your actual survival on this planet is threatened, like something could kill you, then you want that response. But for most of us on a daily basis, that's not really a very adaptive response. So you may be saying at this point, well, then how do I get into this challenge mode? Because it sounds to me a lot better than the fight or flight response for most stresses. So one of the things is just by thinking about assessing your ability to handle the stress that you're facing, the challenge that you're facing. Let's even change that word and say the challenges that you're facing. So you can perhaps consciously evaluate your skills and resources. Can make a list, all of the resources and tools and things that you have at your disposal to help you with this particular challenge in your life. You can remember times that you faced something similar in the past. Oh yeah, I'm taking a test and I've done that before in the past. I've done that and I didn't die. I did it successfully and did a great job when I was this age. And, now I have to take another test, and that's okay because I've done it before and I've survived, and not only just survived it, but you probably did well and you thrived. Or, remembering times if you don't really like public speaking, but you've done it before. Hey, I did it, that other time, and everyone said, great job. And my boss was really pleased. So remembering times that you've overcome something similar and had success. Acknowledging your strengths and your preparation is also part of this. So you can, as you list out your skills and your resources, you can also list your personal strengths in being able to do this. So, I'm really able to think on my feet really well. I am able to ask great questions that will help me navigate any challenges I come up. I'm good at research. I know how to find the answers if I don't know them. So you can list things like that down. And your preparation. So you can list out how you're prepared to do this, whether you've spent time actually getting ready or just things in life in general in your past that have prepared you to deal with this particular challenge. Imagining the support of others. So I think I've said it in several episodes, our brain doesn't really know the difference between what we imagine and what's actually happening in the present moment. So if you imagine just being supported by others, that can actually have a tremendous benefit for you as well. Part of some of the studies that we were learning about in this class talked about one of the worst stressors, which is interesting and surprising on some level, is that social isolation is actually far worse than any other type of stress. So if we're dealing with maybe an illness and we don't have anybody, we don't have family, we don't have friends, we're just home alone by ourselves a lot of the time, that social isolation is actually one of the worst things for our health. So if we can find resources and we can imagine support or ask for support when we need it in this challenge mode, it's tremendously beneficial. And then just getting in that mindset of understanding your stress response can be an asset, not a danger. So for years, I've taught people about stress for almost 10 years now. And for many years, I always talked about, stress is bad for you. And you probably have heard that message in lots of places. And yes, as we can see in that study that I mentioned, stress can be bad for you, but it's partly that belief is what they're coming to find in studies, is if you believe stress is dangerous and could kill you, that actually makes it worse for you than if you say, no, stress isn't dangerous. And if you can tap into this mindset of, challenge mode, then your body is going to respond differently, and stress doesn't have to be dangerous for you. So it's very interesting to kind of shift this new perspective and all of this new research that's coming out there about stress, because we've understood stress kind of one way for a very long time. But stress doesn't necessarily have to be this big, scary thing that we completely avoid in our lives. We can actually learn to use our mindset to start to tap into it as a resource and to see things differently. So seeing what you have to deal with as just a challenge rather than a wild tiger running after you, right? Wild tiger coming to kill you. Sorry, a little tongue-tied here at the end. So spend some time with this. I suggest thinking about something that you have coming up in your life that you might be thinking of as a stressor, and use these questions and these exercises here that I've mentioned at the end to help you shift out of that. And I'll try to put those in the show notes as well, so that you have those points to come back to. Assess your ability to handle the stressor, remember times that you've done it before, consciously evaluating your skills and your resources, acknowledging your strength and preparation, imagining the support, and then again, remembering that stress itself is an asset. It can be an asset if you tap into it in the right way. And I'd be curious what you start to notice if you respond to some of the stressors in your life differently. So thank you again for taking the time out of your life to listen to this episode. I hope it was useful for you. And I'm going to probably have another episode here with a little bit more information, because I'm reviewing this class on stress and our health, which is really fascinating information. So there probably will be a second episode with there's a third stress response that I want to talk about a little bit as well. So until next episode, I will see you in health.